The night belonged to the mountains. Shadows clung to the jagged cliffs like dark stains, and the thin air carried every sound farther than it should. Even the scrape of a boot on stone could echo across the barren ridges, giving away a man's. Positioned to eyes and ears that never slept, Sergeant James Hawk Miller moved like a whisper against the earth, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. His rifle, wrapped in strips of torn fabric and burlap, rested across his chest. Every few seconds, he froze listening, watching, waiting. Behind him, Corporal Daniel "Ghost" Ramirez mirrored his motions. Together, they had become part of the landscape, their bodies smeared with dirt, and their ghillie suits stitched with local foliage, until even the wind seemed to ignore them. For hours, they had been crawling, inch by inch, toward a vantage point, overlooking a cluster of stone ruins where intelligence said a group of insurgents had made camp. The patrol routes in the valley had been ambushed 3 times in the past month, and each time American soldiers had died. Hawk and Ghost had been sent to make sure there wouldn't be a 4th. The climb had been brutal. The rocks shredded their gloves, and the temperature dropped sharply as the night deepened, biting through their layered clothing. Hawk ignored the discomfort. Pain was a companion he had long since accepted. It was noise, like the rattle of loose gear or the crack of a careless branch. And noise was weakness. Weakness got men killed. Ghost whispered once, his voice so soft it barely reached Hawk's ears. 70 meters. Hawk gave a slight nod, his eyes never leaving the slope. Ahead, 70 meters to the ridge. 70 meters until they could settle into position, scan the compound, and wait for the perfect moment. 70 meters might as well have been 70 miles. The approach was always the hardest part of a mission. Combat, Hawk knew, was simple. Point, shoot, survive. But infiltration was an art, an invisible duel against every unseen danger in the terrain. A broken silhouette, a sudden reflection, even the cadence of their crawl, any of it could betray them. He thought back to training, to the endless drills in the swamps of North Carolina. His instructors had been merciless, demanding silence, even when the mosquitoes swarmed so thick that recruits wanted to scream. He remembered the words his sergeant had drilled into him: patience kills, hesitation kills faster. Those words lived in him now, carved deep into the instincts guiding every movement. The ground grew steeper. Hawk flattened himself, pressing his chest to the dirt, feeling the heartbeat of the earth through his vest. He pulled forward with his elbows, sliding his body no more than an inch at a time. Ghost followed, his breath slow and even, as though the 2 men were locked in rhythm with each other's lungs. Above them, the stars shone sharp and bright, untainted by city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a pale scar. It was beautiful, in its own harsh way, but Hawk had no time for beauty. He knew those same stars could betray him. A careless reflection from his scope would burn like a beacon against the night sky, telling the enemy exactly where death was waiting. They paused at a cluster of rocks, taking shelter behind them. Hawk raised a gloved hand, signaling a stop. He pulled a small monocular from his vest and scanned the ruins below. The compound was dark, but faint orange glows flickered through cracks in the stone walls, fires, lanterns, or both. Shadows moved now and then, long and distorted, stretching across the courtyard. Enemy presence confirmed. Hawk lowered the monocular and pressed his hand twice against the ground. Ghost shifted, adjusting the strap on his spotting scope. The younger sniper was calm, but Hawk could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked every movement below. Patience, Hawk whispered. Ghost nodded. He knew. They both knew. The mission was not about speed. It was about perfection. A single missed shot could ruin everything. They resumed crawling, slower than before. The ridge loomed above them now, the final stretch of their approach. Each movement brought them closer to the edge, closer to the vantage point where the mission would truly begin. Hawk's muscles burned from the strain of staying low, but he didn't allow himself to quicken his pace. Speed was noise. Noise was death. Halfway up the slope, Hawk froze. A sound faint, but there. His heart quickened. He raised a clenched fist, signaling Ghost to halt. For several seconds, they lay motionless, ears straining. There it was again. A stone tumbling down the slope, not far from them. Hawk's eyes. Narrowed? Goats? Shepherds? Or were scouts? He lowered his body even further, pressing his face against the dirt. Ghost mirrored him. They waited, the seconds dragging into minutes. Finally, a shape appeared, a lone villager, herding 2 goats along the slope. The animals' hooves knocked loose the rocks that had betrayed them. Hawk exhaled slowly. The man didn't even glance their way. To him, they were nothing but shadows in the dirt. Still, Hawk waited until the shepherd was gone. Only then did he motion Ghost forward. The lesson was simple. Never assume safety. The last 30 meters stretched like an eternity. Hawk's arms ached, his stomach pressed hard against the rocky ground. Sweat soaked his undershirt, chilling his skin. Ghost's breathing had grown heavier, though still controlled. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. Finally, they reached the ridge. Hawk eased himself into position, sliding behind a cluster of boulders that offered both cover and a clear line of sight into the compound below. Ghost settled beside him, unfolding the spotting scope, adjusting the tripod legs until it balanced perfectly on the uneven rock. For the first time in hours, Hawk allowed himself a full breath. They had made it. The approach was complete. Now came the waiting game. Below them, the compound seemed peaceful. A few fighters lingered near the courtyard, rifles slung lazily over their shoulders. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air. It might have been a scene from centuries ago, men gathered around a flame, laughing, telling stories. Not for the weapons and the blood that stained their hands. Ghost leaned close, whispering, 6 confirmed. Maybe more inside. Hawk nodded, his eye pressed to his rifle scope. He studied the courtyard, noting angles, cover, potential escape. Routes, every detail mattered. The men below had no idea death was perched above them, watching, waiting. They laughed, oblivious to the crosshairs already ghosting across their bodies. But Hawk did not fire, not yet. Timing was everything. One shot too soon, and the rest would scatter, vanishing into the ruins. They needed to wait until the targets clustered together, until there was no escape. So they watched, and they waited. The night stretched on, measured in heartbeats and the slow tick of time. The mountain winds whispered around them, carrying the scent of smoke and dust. Their bodies ached, but their minds sharpened. The silent approach was over. The hunt had just begun. The mountains were silent again, but silence never meant peace. It was only the thin pause between storms, the breath before chaos. Hawk lay flat against the rocks, his rifle steady, eyes locked on the compound below. Beside him, Ghost adjusted. The spotting scope, his movements smooth, practiced, as if the scope were an extension of his own body. The 2 men didn't speak much. They never needed to. Every mission they had taken together over the years had forged a kind of understanding deeper than language. Hawk's smallest gestures, an arched brow, a glance, even the rhythm of his breathing carried meaning Ghost could read instantly. In return, Ghost's calculations, his whispered corrections, and his steady presence had become Hawk's anchor. They were opposites in many ways, yet somehow fit together perfectly. Hawk was older, his hair already touched with gray at the temples, despite being only in his mid-30s. His face was weathered, skin toughened by deserts, jungles, and many nights spent in places where sleep was a luxury. He had earned the calcine hawk, not just for his keen eyesight, but for the way he hovered above the battlefield, watching, calculating, waiting until the moment he would strike. Ghost was younger by almost a decade. His name was born from his uncanny ability to vanish, to move in and out of sight so cleanly that even fellow soldiers sometimes lost track of him during training. He had grown up in the streets of Los Angeles, raised in a neighborhood where silence and invisibility were often the difference between life and death. The army had given him purpose, but it was Hawk who had taught him discipline, turning his raw instincts into deadly precision. Their bond had been forged not in classrooms or manuals, but in the field, under fire. Hawk remembered one mission vividly, years before, in Iraq. Their unit had been pinned down in a maze of alleyways, insurgents firing from rooftops. Ghost had been a rookie then, his uniform still too clean, his nerves barely under control. Hawk had watched him, seen the tremble in his hands, the quickness of his breaths. But when Hawk gave the order, "Range me the roof, second window, right side," Ghost hadn't hesitated. He rattled off the distance, the wind correction, the angle, his voice sharp and steady. Hawk squeezed the trigger, the target dropped, and the firefight turned. From that moment forward, Hawk knew the kid wasn't just another soldier, he was a partner. Now, years later, they worked like parts of the same weapon. Hawk was the trigger, Ghost the sights. Together, they were flawless. Ghost adjusted the spotting scope again, whispering numbers. Range, 485 meters. Wind, 2 knots east. Adjust .2 mils right. Hawk listened, adjusted, but didn't fire. Not yet. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, relaxed but ready. He trusted Ghost's math, like he trusted his own heartbeat. Ghost never missed a calculation. Still, Ghost worried sometimes. Hawk could see it in his eyes when the nights dragged too long, when missions blurred together. Ghost would stare out at the horizon, his mind far away, as though he feared becoming nothing but a shadow, a figure in someone else's story. Hawk knew the feeling well. Snipers didn't get parades. They didn't get medals pinned in front of cheering crowds. They worked in silence, died in silence, and were remembered only in the whispers of those they saved. But Hawk also knew that was their strength. Fame distracted, recognition killed. Silence kept them alive. The bond between them was more than trust, it was survival. Hawk had seen teams crumble because their members didn't understand each other. He'd watched spotters freeze under pressure, watched shooters panic when things didn't go according to plan. But with Ghost, there was none of that. They could sit in the same hide for 72 hours, barely exchanging a word, and yet remain perfectly synchronized. Hawk knew that if he went down, Ghost would drag him out, no matter the cost. Ghost knew the same about Hawk. That kind of bond wasn't taught. It was earned, shot by shot, mission by mission. The night deepened, and the fires in the compound flickered lower. Hawk lowered his rifle for a moment, stretching his arms carefully, silently. Ghost did the same, massaging his fingers before returning to the scope. Their bodies ached, but neither complained. Pain was part of the ritual. "Remember Fallujah?" Ghost whispered suddenly, his voice barely above the wind. Hawk smirked. "Hard to forget." Ghost chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Fallujah had been hell. They had been tasked with eliminating a mortar crew that had been shelling American positions. The hide site had been a half-collapsed building, infested with rats, a stench of rot so thick it clung to their clothes for weeks. Hawk had taken the shots, but it was Ghost who had saved them, spotting the enemy counter-sniper a split second before the shot rang out. Hawk had ducked, the bullet shattering the wall inches from his head. Ghost had marked the shooter's position, and Hawk had ended it. 1 second slower, and Hawk wouldn't be lying here tonight. They didn't talk about Fallujah often, but sometimes, in quiet moments like this, they let the memories breathe. It reminded them why they trusted each other with everything. Hawk glanced at Ghost. The younger man's eyes were glued to the scope, sharp and steady. He thought about how far Ghost had come since that first mission in Iraq. The kid from the streets was long gone. What remained was a professional, a ghost in every sense, silent, deadly, unseen. Still, Hawk felt the weight of responsibility. He was the senior man, the one who had to bring them both home. Every decision he made carried Ghost's life in it, and that was a burden Hawk accepted willingly. The laughter of the enemy fighters drifted up from the compound. Hawk returned to his rifle, adjusting the scope, marking each target mentally. Ghost whispered again, the words steady, calm. They didn't need to say more. The bond between them said everything else. For the next few hours, they remained like that, two men pressed into the mountain, watching, waiting, breathing in rhythm. They were patient. They were precise. They were ready. And together, they were unstoppable. The mountains didn't care who lived or died. They swallowed men whole, grinding them down with heat by day, cold by night, and silence in between. Hawk and Ghost knew this truth better than most. 3 days had passed since they had reached the ridge. 3 days of lying in the dirt, pressed against jagged stone, bodies aching and stiff from stillness. 3 days of breathing dust, rationing water, and fighting the enemy within their own thoughts. This was the sniper's world, not the flash of the rifle or the sharp crack of a bullet, but the endless waiting that led to it. From their hide, they had a clear view of the compound below. It was an old ruined walls crumbling, half buried in the earth, but still standing strong enough to shelter men who thrived in shadows. 6 fighters, sometimes more, came and went, rifles always within reach. They moved with arrogance, convinced. The mountain gave them cover. Hawk watched them through his scope, studying every detail. How one man scratched his beard before lighting a cigarette, how another limped slightly on his right leg, how they gathered in the courtyard at dawn, and dusk. Ghost logged it all in a small waterproof notebook. Distances, times, wind readings, even the way smoke curled from their fires. Nothing was too small. Patterns built pictures. Pictures told the future. And the future, if they read it right, ended in death for the men below. On the first night, Ghost whispered, they change sentries every 2 hours. Hawk grunted. Discipline means training. Or fear, Ghost countered. Hawk didn't answer. He knew Ghost might be right. These weren't amateurs, but they weren't hardened professionals either. They were careful, but not careful enough. The second day tested their endurance. The sun beat down with merciless heat, baking the rocks until they scorched the skin. Hawk and Ghost couldn't move, couldn't shift positions more than a few millimeters. Sweat soaked their clothes, stinging their eyes. Flies gathered, crawling across their faces, but they couldn't swat them away. Any sudden movement risked being spotted. Patience, always patience. Hawk thought back to training again, those endless days lying in swamp mud, ants crawling across his skin, mosquitoes drilling into his neck. He had learned then what he lived now. Comfort was an illusion. Survival was focus. He let the pain wash over him, ignored the itch, the burn, the cramp. Pain couldn't kill him. Carelessness could. Ghost endured it too, though Hawk could see the tension in his jaw. Feels like we've been here a month, Ghost whispered. Hawk smirked. Only 3 days. You'll live. Ghost chuckled under his breath, then went back to his scope. On the third night, movement in the compound changed. A new group arrived, 3. Men, one carrying a radio. Hawk's pulse quickened. Radios meant coordination, meant larger plans. The men spoke quickly, gesturing toward the valley. Ghost noted the times, the body language, the gear they carried. Looks like they're planning another ambush, Ghost murmured. Not if we get them first, Hawk said quietly. The night stretched long. Stars wheeled above, cold and distant. Hawk fought drowsiness with discipline, blinking slowly, shifting his eyes from the scope to the horizon and back. A sniper couldn't afford to sleep when the enemy might change routine. Ghost rotated watch with him, one observing while the other rested in 15-minute shifts. It wasn't real rest, but it was enough to keep their minds sharp. Every sound carried meaning. The bray of a donkey in a distant village, the crackle of firewood, a crunch of boots on gravel. Hawk filtered it all, distinguishing the harmless from the dangerous. It was during one of those quiet moments that Hawk noticed something. A man emerged from the compound, urinating against the wall before lighting a cigarette. The glow flared, casting his face in the dark. Hawk locked onto it through the scope. Scar above the eyebrow, thin lips, cold eyes. He recognized the description from the briefing. This was one of the local cell leaders. Confirmation. Target priority. He didn't take the shot. Not yet. Too much risk of scattering the others. But now they had a face to the mission. Ghost scribbled notes, then whispered, "That's him." Hawk nodded. "We wait." Waiting became their weapon. Every hour added to their advantage. The longer they observed, the clearer the enemy's routine became. By dawn on the fourth day, they knew everything. When the men ate, when they slept, when they smoked, even which wall they leaned against when talking. Patterns became opportunities. Opportunities became targets. Hawk stretched his fingers carefully, feeling the stiffness. Ghost passed him a sip of lukewarm water from the canteen. They said nothing. Words weren't necessary anymore. The sun rose again, painting the mountains gold. Below, the fighters gathered in the courtyard, laughing and shouting. Hawk lowered his eye to the scope, watching, waiting. Ghost adjusted his spotting scope, calling out wind corrections in a whisper. The time was close. They could feel it. And so they waited, motionless in the dirt, as the enemy unknowingly prepared to step into the crosshairs of fate. The intelligence had been gathered. The waiting was over. The kill was coming. The fourth morning broke sharp and cold. The air carried a metallic bite, the kind that crept into joints and made every movement stiff. Frost glistened faintly on the rocks, melting as the sun's first rays stretched over the ridge. Hawk and Ghost had been awake long before dawn, eyes trained on the compound below, bodies locked into position like statues. They had waited 3 days for a moment like this. The fighters began to emerge from the crumbling stone walls, yawning, stretching, slinging rifles over their shoulders. One by one they drifted into the courtyard. Soon, 6 of them stood together, laughing and talking, smoke curling from cigarettes that glowed faint orange in the early light. Hawk's eye pressed. Against his scope, the world narrowing into crosshairs and targets. Every detail sharpened, the tilt of a man's head, the angle of a rifle against his back, the way his chest rose with each breath. He didn't see men anymore. He saw angles, distances, solutions. Ghost adjusted the spotting scope, voice low. Calm. Range 480 meters. Wind 1 knot west. .1 mils left. Targets grouped center courtyard. Hawk exhaled slowly. 480 meters. A comfortable distance, well within their kill zone. His heartbeat slowed, each thump echoing steady and deep. He could feel the weight of the rifle pressing against his shoulder, the trigger cool against his fingertip. Every nerve, every thought. Every muscle narrowed into a single line of purpose. Ghost's eyes flicked from target to target, lips moving silently as he tracked. He wasn't just watching, he was anticipating, predicting movement before it happened. 2 smoking. 1 limping priority target. Scarface present. 6 total. Scarface, the leader. The man they had been waiting for. Hawk's crosshairs lingered on him, memorizing the lines of his face. He would be first. The courtyard buzzed with casual life. Cigarette smoke drifted upward. Rifles clinked as men shifted. Boots scuffed against dirt. To the fighters, this was just another morning. To Hawk and Ghost, it was the culmination of days of suffering, patience, and silence. Timing, Hawk whispered. Ghost nodded. Timing was everything. Too soon, and survivors would scatter into cover. Too late, and the opportunity would vanish. They needed the perfect second, the breath between movements when all 6 were exposed. The fighters laughed louder, voices carrying across the valley. One slapped another on the back, pointing at something in the distance. They clustered closer. Together, their weapons hanging loose. Ghost's hand settled on Hawk's shoulder, a silent signal. No. Hawk's world shrank. The mountains, the sky, the wind, all of it vanished. There was only the rifle, the scope, and the targets below. He slowed his breathing, inhaled, exhaled, let the rhythm steady him. The scar-faced leader took a step forward, turning just enough for Hawk to see the curve of his cheekbone through the crosshairs. Hawk's finger tightened against the trigger. Ghost whispered one word, send. Hawk's lungs emptied in a slow breath. Time stretched, the silence before a storm. This was the trap. Days of crawling, of waiting, of becoming ghosts in the dirt, all of it led to this heartbeat. The enemy laughed, careless, blind to the death that perched above them. Hawk squeezed. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, a sharp crack splitting the morning stillness. The scar-faced leader dropped instantly, and the world changed forever. The first shot cracked through the dawn, like lightning tearing across a silent sky. Scarface collapsed instantly, his cigarette tumbling from his lips as his body folded into the dirt. The men beside him froze in shock, eyes widening, heads whipping toward the sound that never truly reached them. At 480 meters, the muzzle's thunder arrived at heartbeat too late by then. Their leader was already dead. Hawk didn't hear the echo. Not really. His world had narrowed into a tunnel of precision. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder, the scope lifting for a fraction of a second before settling back into focus. His finger eased off the trigger, then reset, ready for the next kill. Ghost's voice was steady, clipped, exact. Target 2 left flank, crouching. Range steady. Send. Hawk adjusted a hair's breadth, crosshairs sliding to the man fumbling for his rifle. He exhaled, squeezed. Another crack split the morning. Target 2 collapsed backward, arms flailing as the weapon slipped from his hands. 2 shots. 4 seconds gone. The courtyard erupted in chaos. The remaining fighters shouted, scrambling for cover, but panic dulled. Their movements. Ghost was already marking them. His voice was calm, the calm of a man who had rehearsed this 1,000 times. 3 middle moving. Adjust .1 left. Send. Hawk tracked the figure, a man sprinting across the courtyard, toward a low wall. The crosshairs followed, leading just ahead of his chest. Breath steady. Squeezed out. The man jerked mid-stride, momentum carrying him a few more steps before he crumpled into the dirt. 3 down. 7 seconds. The survivors finally understood. They weren't in a firefight. They weren't trading bullets. They were prey under a hunter's gaze, caught in a storm of invisible precision. 4 by the fire pit, reaching low. Range hold. Send. The shot snapped out. The fighter's hand never reached his rifle. He toppled sideways, face first into the ashes, smoke curling around his body. 4 down. 9 seconds. Ghost's tone didn't change, though Hawk could feel his partner's pulse racing in sync with his own. There was no triumph, no rush of victory, only execution. 5 limping, 1 moving right. 1/4 mil adjustment. Send. The limping fighter ducked behind a barrel, peering over as if the crude cover could save him. Hawk waited a fraction of a second, breath even, letting the man expose himself. The instant he rose to aim, Hawk's finger tightened. The bullet punched clean through his head. He fell backward, limbs twitching. 5 down. 12 seconds. Only 1 remained, scrambling wildly toward the compound door. His rifle clattered against the stones, feet slipping as he stumbled for safety. Ghost's voice carried no hesitation. 6 last 1 doorway. No wind. Send. Hawk tracked him smoothly. The man reached the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, his body half inside, half out. For a moment, Hawk saw his face, eyes wide with terror. Mouth open in a scream, it carried no sound this far up the ridge. Hawk squeezed. The bullet struck center mass. The man slammed into the doorway, sliding down the stone like a broken doll. 6 down. 14 seconds. Silence fell. The courtyard, moments ago alive with movement and laughter, lay still. Smoke drifted from the fire pit, curling lazily around the bodies strewn across the dirt. Rifles lay abandoned, their owners never to lift them. Again, Hawk exhaled, finally allowing himself a breath. His finger eased from the trigger, the rifle steady in his hands. The storm had passed as quickly as it had begun. Ghost leaned back from the spotting scope, eyes scanning the scene below. 6 confirmed, he whispered. Hawk nodded, though his gaze remained through the scope. He swept across the courtyard, checking for survivors, for movement, for anything they had missed. Nothing. The compound was silent. 14 seconds. 6 lives erased. The weight of it pressed on Hawk's chest, though not in guilt. He had long since learned that guilt had no place here. Each shot wasn't just death, it was prevention. 6 fewer men to set ambush, plant bombs, or take the lives of soldiers who had no idea they were walking into traps. Still, the silence afterward always felt heavy. Ghost closed his notebook, slipping it back into his vest. Clean, he said. Softly. Hawk pulled away from the scope, stretching his neck, his muscles tight from the rapid sequence. He could feel the burn in his arms, the stiffness in his trigger finger. The body might have screamed fatigue, but the mind remained sharp, alive with adrenaline. He glanced at Ghost. The younger man's face was calm, eyes steady, though Hawk knew the weight sat with him too. Ghost carried every number, every range, call, every correction as if it were his own shot. Their kills were shared, a burden and a bond between them. Below, the compound seemed frozen. No movement, no sound but the faint crackle of fire. But Hawk knew the quiet wouldn't last. Others would come. Fighters who had been away would return, or allies from nearby villages would investigate. Time was running. Pack it, Hawk said. Quietly. Ghost nodded. They moved with precision, dismantling their gear quickly but silently. The spotting scope folded, the notebook secured, rifles checked and strapped. They erased traces of their presence, the discipline drilled into them. Never allowed arrogance to leave behind evidence. Within minutes, they were sliding back from the ridge, melting into the terrain. The compound below remained a graveyard. 6 men had fallen in less time than it took to read a sentence. For Hawk and Ghost, it was not celebration. It was not victory. It was simply another mission. 14 seconds of fire, carried out by 2 men who had trained their entire lives for moments like this. And already, they were shadows again, gone before the mountain could give up their position. The last echo of gunfire rolled off the mountains and was gone, swallowed by the vast silence of the Afghan valley. 6 bodies lay crumpled in the courtyard below, their laughter silenced forever. Smoke drifted in thin ribbons, curling against the pale morning light. Hawk pulled his eye from the scope. His breathing was steady, his expression calm, but his body hummed with the tension of the last 14 seconds. Ghost, beside him, closed the spotting scope with the same composure. He had carried through the firefight. Neither man spoke. There was no need. The job was done. But the mission wasn't over. Hawk scanned the compound one last time, eyes sharp. No movement, no reinforcements yet. But they would come. A shot that clean, that loud, wouldn't stay. Secret. Allies, family, fighters, someone would come looking. And when they found what lay below, they would scour the hills for whoever had done it. Time to go, Hawk said quietly. Ghost nodded, already dismantling the tripod. Their exit had to be as precise as their kill fast enough to stay ahead of discovery, but slow enough to remain invisible. Panic killed more snipers than bullets ever did. They began breaking down the hide site. Every movement was practiced, drilled, automatic. Spent brass casings collected, scope lenses capped, camouflage netting rolled tight. Hawk brushed away the shallow impressions their elbows and knees had left in the dirt, scattering loose pebbles to cover any trace. Even here, miles from anyone's eyes, they erased themselves. 2 minutes, Hawk muttered. Ghost worked faster, slipping the last of their gear into his pack. He tugged at the straps, testing the weight, making sure nothing clattered or jingled. Hawk did the same, securing his rifle tight across his chest. A single clink of metal could betray them as easily as a gunshot. They began their withdrawal. The slope was steep, jagged with loose rock. Hawk moved first, belly low, sliding inch by inch. Ghost followed, shadowing his movements. They had learned to move as one body. If Hawk froze, Ghost froze. If Hawk advanced, Ghost advanced. A mountain pressed in around them, every sound amplified. The crunch of a pebble under their knees seemed deafening. Hawk's eyes flicked constantly, scanning for movement, listening for footsteps, voices. The bark of an order in a language he knew too well. Minutes passed. They covered only a dozen meters. The urgency pulled at Hawk's chest like a tightening rope, but he forced himself to stay deliberate. Rushing now would undo everything. Halfway down the slope, they froze. A sound echoed faintly, a voice carried on the wind. Hawk pressed flat to the dirt, hand raised. Ghost halted instantly, eyes sharp. They lay motionless, hearts pounding against the earth, ears straining. Another voice answered, shouting now. From below, Hawk's stomach tightened. Someone had discovered the bodies. The voices grew louder, filled with alarm and rage. Boots clattered against stone. More than one. Maybe a dozen. The enemy had come. Hawk turned his head slightly, meeting Ghost's eyes. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. Stay calm, stay invisible. They resumed their crawl, slower now, more careful than ever. The voices carried up the slope, but distance and terrain were on their side. The mountain, harsh as it was, shielded them too. Step by step, meter by meter, they melted into the rocks. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning chill. Sweat trickled down Hawk's back, soaking his shirt, but he ignored it. His world had shrunk to the rhythm of movement. Elbows forward, knees dragging, body pressed flat. Ghost mirrored him perfectly, never faltering. An hour passed. Then 2. The compound was far behind them now, but the tension hadn't lifted. Somewhere below, men were still shouting, their voices carrying like ghosts of anger. Hawk didn't dare stop. At last, they reached a narrow gully, choked with boulders. Hawk signaled a halt, sliding into the shadows. Ghost joined him, both men sitting back for the first time in hours. Hawk pulled his canteen, took a sip of warm, metallic-tasting water, then passed it to Ghost. They didn't speak. Silence was their shield. The gully wound deeper into the mountains, and they followed it like shadows, steps soft, bodies hunched low. Their ghillie suits caught dust and branches, their faces streaked with dirt, until they were almost indistinguishable from the terrain. Hawk thought of the shepherd they had seen days earlier, the goats climbing the slopes. If a villager spotted them now, rumors would spread, and the enemy would search these hills with a vengeance. Ghost seemed to think the same. His eyes scanned every ridge, every cluster of rocks, wary of more than just fighters. In war, anyone could be a threat. By late afternoon, the sun baked the land, heat shimmering off stone. Hawk found a shaded overhang and signaled a rest. They slipped beneath it, packs against the wall, rifles across their laps. The stillness was suffocating, the silence so complete it roared in their ears. Ghost finally broke it, whispering, "They'll never know who hit them." Hawk glanced at him. "They'll know enough. 6 dead, 14 seconds. That's all they need to know." Ghost's mouth tightened, but he nodded. The younger man carried the weight, differently, less hardened, more human. Hawk respected that. It kept them balanced. Hawk was steel. Ghost was shadow. As evening fell, they moved again. Step by step, mile by mile, they vanished into the wilderness. By the time darkness covered the mountains, the compound was just another scar in the valley, its dead buried under the night. The hunters had become shadows once more, unseen, unheard, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. The vanishing was complete. The compound lay silent, a tomb under the rising sun, but miles away the ripples of the morning's violence were only just beginning to be felt. Back at base, the first reports arrived slowly. Drones overhead had captured the aftermath. 6 insurgents lying motionless in the courtyard, weapons abandoned, fires still smoldering. The patrols that had been terrorized for weeks by roadside bombs and ambushes could breathe again, even if only for a moment. Commanders gathered, faces grave yet tinged with disbelief. The reports were precise. 6 confirmed kills in a matter of seconds. The details were almost impossible. No firefight, no warning, no trace of the shooters. They called it miraculous. Some whispered it was luck. Others, more experienced, understood the truth. It was precision born from relentless training and fun. Nerves of steel. Hawk and Ghost arrived later that afternoon, moving through the base like they always did. Silent, understated, unnoticed, except by those who were watching for them. Their packs were lighter, their rifles cleaned and slung. They had left the mountains behind, leaving only footprints that would vanish in the next rainfall. "You two are gods," one of the younger soldiers muttered, catching sight of them. How the hell did they disappear without a trace? Hawk ignored it. Ghost shrugged lightly, but didn't answer. Praise was a distraction. Glory could be deadly. They were not here for accolades. They were here to keep their brothers alive. In the mess hall, the story had already spread. Eyes widened as soldiers whispered about the ghost shots. The invisible strike that had wiped out an entire squad in 14 seconds. Every patrolman who had ever felt the weight of ambush or the sudden snap of bullets knew the value of what had happened. Survival had been purchased with minutes of steel and patience, yet Hawk and Ghost barely ate. The adrenaline from the mission still pulsed in their veins. Hawk stared out the window at the mountains in the distance, the ridges where every movement had been measured, every breath calculated. He could still see the targets, frozen in his mind, the exact placement of each shot. Ghost sat across from him, slowly sipping water, his eyes distant. Hawk knew what he was thinking. The faces of those they had killed, the knowledge that each shot had ended a life that someone somewhere might have loved. Even in war, even with reason and orders, the cost weighed. Didn't feel like much, did it? Ghost finally muttered. Hawk shook his head. It never does. The base command called a debrief later that evening. Hawk and Ghost answered questions quietly, succinctly. Distances, wind corrections, target behavior. No embellishments, no drama, just facts. The debriefing was over quickly. They knew nothing they said could capture the enormity of what had happened. It was enough that their calculations were precise, their timing perfect, their exit clean. Outside, soldiers who had survived previous ambushes began walking patrols with renewed confidence. Morale lifted. Conversations in tents shifted from fear to determination. The invisible hand that had struck from the mountains reminded everyone that even in chaos, some forces moved silently, watching, protecting. Still, Hawk and Ghost felt no relief. For them, the mission ended the moment they stepped from the ridges. There was no celebration. Death, even executed flawlessly, left an imprint. They carried the mental ledger with them always. In the following days, they received briefings on resumed patrols. No ambushes occurred. Enemy movements slowed. Intelligence suggested the insurgents in that region had been disrupted entirely. 6 kills in 14 seconds had not just removed the immediate threat, they had shattered the network that had been causing so much grief to American troops. The whispers grew into legend among the soldiers. Some spoke of them as ghosts, unseen guardians of the ridges. Others told the story more dramatically, exaggerating seconds into minutes, single shots into unending barrages. Hawk and Ghost neither confirmed nor denied. They remained quiet, shadows moving through camp, known only to those who needed to know. At night, Hawk sometimes returned to the ridge in his mind. He remembered the light catching the scars on the enemy's faces, the way smoke curled around the fire pit, the rhythm of Ghost calling out ranges. He relived it silently, step by step, shot by shot. Ghost, too, revisited the moments. He recalled the pulse of adrenaline, the whisper of the wind, the exact angle of the last target. Even in sleep, their minds kept tally. Precision demanded remembrance. Forgetting meant recklessness next time. Hawk found himself reflecting not just on the technicalities of the mission, but the morality. The weight of 6 lives, cut down without warning, pressed heavily. Ghost had handled it differently. His youth allowed him to compartmentalize more easily, but Hawk carried a balance of sorrow and duty. Each shot saved dozens of others. Yet saving lives didn't erase the ones taken. Even amid exhaustion, the pair trained each day, running drills, practicing wind corrections, reviewing past missions. The body heals fast, but the mind must remain sharp. They could not afford weakness. One afternoon, Ghost spoke up while checking his rifle. "Do you think they'll remember this?" Hawk raised an eyebrow. "The enemy? They'll fear it. Our men? Some will know. Most will just benefit and move on. That's the way it works." Ghost nodded. "It's just hard not to think about them." Hawk put a hand on his shoulder. "That's why we do this together. We watch each other, keep each other steady." For soldiers who lived in silence, that bond was more important than any medal, any commendation. The days passed, the mountains in the distance untouched, indifferent, vast. The valley below returned to a strange calm, the chaos erased, though memory lingered. Patrols resumed with renewed courage. Enemy attacks slowed. The 14-second strike had not just killed 6 men, it had shifted the balance, if only temporarily. In a theater of endless danger, in the mess halls, whispers persisted. Stories became legend. Even soldiers who had never met Hawk or Ghost spoke of them as if they were folklore, invisible protectors perched on the ridges, striking unseen, leaving no trace but silence. But for the two men themselves, it was not legend. It was responsibility, carried quietly, invisibly. Every mission ended the same way, with the weight of what was done pressing down, even as the world above moved on. Hawk and Ghost returned to the mountains in their thoughts each night, tracing the lines of the ridges, remembering the targets, rehearsing their movements. Even in rest, their minds remained vigilant. Silence and precision were the currency of survival. Somewhere in that quiet, in that invisible vigilance, they understood a truth that few could comprehend. The loudest victories in war often belonged to those who never spoke of them, who moved like shadows, and who vanished before anyone could see them. And so the legend grew, not in medals, not in speeches, but in whispered gratitude and the relief of soldiers who walked freely because two men had moved unseen, struck precisely, and disappeared into the shadows. Hawk and Ghost remained silent, their burden shared but never discussed. That was how they survived. That was how they would continue to fight. The aftermath was more than victory. It was a reminder that some men existed not for glory, but for the quiet preservation of life through the exercise of deadly skill. And in the silent corridors of the base, the whispers would always be there. The snipers who struck like ghosts, 6 in 14 seconds, and disappeared without a trace. Weeks had passed since the 14 seconds that changed a valley. The mountains remained indifferent, their jagged ridges bathed in shifting light, shadows stretching like silent witnesses to the unseen. Hawk and Ghost were no longer on that ridge, no longer perched above the ruined compound. Yet in the minds of those who served in the valley, their presence lingered. Stories had begun to take shape, whispered between patrols and bunkers. Soldiers spoke of two invisible figures perched on the high ridges, eyes like hawks, hands like death itself. They were the ghosts who appeared when no one expected, struck with precision, and vanished before a cry could be heard. No one knew their names, but everyone respected the deadly skill behind the myth. At base, life returned to its rigid rhythm. Patrols, briefings, equipment checks. Yet the morale shift was palpable. Soldiers moved with more confidence. Their hearts lighter, their nerves steadier. Somewhere in the valley, insurgents had learned the hard way that the mountains were not a refuge. 6 men gone in 14 seconds had created a caution that would ripple for weeks. The fear was invisible, but real a legacy of discipline and patience. Hawk and Ghost had returned to routine, though neither spoke of the mission. They trained daily, running drills and reviewing wind patterns, adjusting for angles, practicing camouflage, reviewing every detail from memory. For them, the victory was not celebrated, it was analyzed. Every success had to be repeatable, or it was meaningless. The mountains had taught them discipline, patience, and invisibility, but above all, it had taught them humility in the face of mortality. Ghost sometimes lingered on the edge of the compound in his thoughts, replaying the 14 seconds, the way smoke curled around the fire pit, the way each shot landed with inevitability. Hawk, older and steadier, carried the weight differently, calculating, observing, feeling the pulse of the mountains, the rhythm of wind and gravity and mortality. Together, they shared the burden silently, two halves of the same shadow, moving in perfect synchronization. At night, when the base was quiet, Hawk often sat outside his tent, gazing toward the distant ridges. He could almost see them in his mind, the perfect alignment of rocks and foliage, the crosshairs tracing their path, Ghost's calm voice whispering adjustments. These memories were not regrets, they were discipline. They were reminders that in war, precision and patience could save lives, even if it meant taking others. Ghost joined him occasionally, silently settling beside Hawk, sharing the same view. They didn't speak. Words were unnecessary. The bond between them had been forged through years of shared missions, risk, and the understanding that every movement could mean life or death. Their eyes would meet briefly, a small nod or a blink acknowledging the unspoken. We survived, and we protected our own. The legend of their strike had grown beyond the valley. Reports filtered back to higher command. Patrols no longer ambushed. Insurgent movement slowed, local civilians whispering of shadows on the ridges. Soldiers in distant outposts had heard tales of the snipers who move like ghosts, unseen, unstoppable. The myth had outgrown reality, but in war, perception often mattered as much as fact. Hawk understood the danger of legend. Myth could inspire allies, but it could also draw enemies' attention. Yet he allowed it to persist, not out of vanity, but necessity. Fear of the unseen was a weapon as potent as any rifle. Ghost, ever practical, smiled sometimes at the stories, but never indulged them. They did not exist for fame. They existed for duty, and duty demanded silence. The valley eventually quieted, the enemy regrouping slowly, cautiously. Hawk and Ghost were assigned to new missions, new ridges, new threats. But every operation carried the shadow of that 14-second strike, the standard of perfection they had set for themselves. Every decision, every observation, every calculation thereafter was measured against the benchmark of precision, patience, and invisibility. Yet even in silence, the consequences of their actions were never far. Hawk knew that every life they had taken belonged to someone's sons, brothers, fathers. Ghost carried a similar awareness, though he processed it differently, compartmentalizing the weight. They had become something more than soldiers, protectors and executioners, ghosts and witnesses, bound by a code no one else could fully understand. Time passed, seasons shifted, and the mountains remained eternal. Hawk and Ghost moved with them, shadows among shadows. They trained new recruits, teaching them the fundamentals: patience, discipline, observation, and the lethal art of remaining unseen. But the legend was theirs alone. No student could replicate the precise rhythm of those 14 seconds. No story could capture the tension, the absolute calm, and the deadly focus required to execute perfection. Occasionally, Hawk would find himself back on that ridge in his mind, crosshairs lining up with the first target, Ghost's voice guiding him, steady and calm. He could feel the weight of the rifle, the tension in his fingers, the stillness of the mountain air. Every shot, every breath, every calculation had been exact. And for a fleeting moment, Hawk allowed himself to feel the enormity of it, not pride, not triumph, but the stark clarity of duty fulfilled. Ghost, too, reflected on the event, less with weight and more with precision. In his quiet moments, he would replay the numbers, the distances, the timing. 480 meters, 1 knot west wind, 14 seconds to 6 targets. He analyzed every detail, as if dissecting the world itself. That clarity was his peace. That understanding was his armor. Together, they were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were shadows on ridges, guardians of unseen perimeters, legends, born from silence, patience, and precision. They had struck in 14 seconds, yet their presence stretched far beyond the valley, shaping perceptions, altering behavior, and protecting countless lives. The soldiers who survived those ambushes would never know the faces of the men who had saved them. They only knew the result, the absence of death, the absence of fear in immediate moments, the reassurance that unseen eyes watched over them. That was enough. That was all that mattered. In the quiet evenings, when the wind rustled through the tents and the stars hung cold and distant above the mountains, Hawk and Ghost would sit together, watching the horizon. They spoke little, but the silence was full of understanding. No medals were awarded. No public accolades came. They didn't need them. The mountains, the ridges, the silent echo of those 14 seconds, all carried more weight than any ceremony ever could. And so their legend endured, not written in books, not celebrated in parades, but whispered among soldiers, carried across valleys and ridges, remembered in briefings and patrol reports, an invisible shield over those they protected. Hawk and Ghost had vanished from the compound, disappeared into the mountains, yet the impact of their actions rippled endlessly. In the shadows, they moved, trained, observed, and waited, always ready to strike again with the same patience and precision. They were not celebrated. They were not seen. They were not acknowledged. And that was exactly as it should be. They were legends in the shadows, and the mountains remembered.